Thank you everyone for coming to the conference and to our talk. In this talk, we'll talk about some modern UI concepts for CloudStack and some ideas and experiments in the whole journey and story. Let me start by introducing my colleague Anurag.
Hi everyone, I'm Anurag. I'm relatively new to CloudStack, almost completing 1 year now, and I've been working with ShadeBlue. It's been a very exciting journey. Previously, I worked at companies like Twitter, but never on open source. So this is my first open source journey. Great.
Thank you, Anurag. I must add that Anurag is a very smart guy, like one of the smartest people I've worked with. It's a privilege to have him here as well. About me, I'm Rohit Yadav. I've come from Gurgaon, India. I'm one of the oldest dinosaurs in the community. 7+ years, going strong in the CloudStack community. The only difference is in the last 7 years, the dinosaur has gained a lot of weight, has grown a mustache, lost some hair, and some of the hair has gone grey. Other than that, I love cats a lot. These are my cats, Ashley and Gracie. You can see at the bottom. And that's a reference of Paul's joke in his keynote. So in this presentation, what we'll do is I'll try to go over, from my perspective, the state of the CloudStack UI, some lessons learned in the last 7 years, some experiments we'll see that I've actually gone through, but nothing to kind of fruition. I'll talk about some side project that I started. We'll do some demos, and maybe we'll discuss, propose like what should be the next step for the community as general, the Apache way. So the state of CloudStack UI, I think so when compared to other stacks, one of the pros of CloudStack is that the UI is something that stands out. It's easy for someone new to kind of play with an iOS platform. The UI provides all of that. That was kind of true in 2008, some 7 to 10 years ago. But in those 10 years, a lot of things have changed. But I would say CloudStack UI is the last one which has gone any major changes. The UI, if you look at the code base, for example, it's highly imperatively styled code, jQuery based, and a lot of the methodologies are old, like the CSS, and a lot of those changes, they are hard to maintain, administrate, extend, and get new developers to kind of teach them. A couple of things is there's no browser history. So one of the things that most of the new people do is they will log into CloudStack, they will go to a different view, click on the back button, and you're back to the login page, or you're back to the previous website that you are looking into. There are single JavaScript files that are so large, like there's a file called system.js that's like 22,000 lines of code. So it's unmaintainable. Now I've specifically mentioned and written a ruler there. It's actually not a joke. I'll say the UI is largely ruler driven. For those of us who actually don't know the history, I've seen my colleagues in my previous organization where they will use a standard monitor, tilt them so you get like from a portrait, like a landscape to a portrait view. Then they'll use a large ruler to actually match and ensure that the braces are properly closed. So that's actually for real, and you can see this is a kind of a screenshot of system.js file, and you can see a lot of indentations and whatnot, and that's how the CloudStack UI was and is being developed. That's an issue, and so that's just to emphasize on the fact that it's hard to maintain, extend, and develop. And it's certainly very difficult for new engineers that we hire to get them started, learn, onboard, and whatnot. So those are some key issues. So what I did was, we have a lot of this kind of, I certainly have this itch. So about a couple of years ago, I thought, it's time to kind of, write a new UI. So I started with this small project internally called Project X because I couldn't think of a name. And this is a screenshot of that project. Now, this was just a POC. I actually circulated that between my colleagues and some friends in the community, but not at large. So nobody has actually seen this before. And the idea was to build a UI that's kind of more modern, that can be responsive and flexible, so that it can adapt to the various screens like tablets and phones and those kind of things. But one of the things I learned is that UI is very hard. At that time in 2014, there was about 300, 400 APIs. So you can think of every API to do something with the UI element, whether it is an action button, a table that lists a few things, a detail view like this. You can see in this example, we have an instances tab where you can search in sort of a middle kind of widget, and on the right hand side things show up which has different tabs like next, volume, snapshot, details, and there are action buttons. To actually implement this took me a lot of time, and you have to manually implement a specific view with an API in mind. So every API can have a different view, and to do that manually for, let's say, 600 APIs now. So CloudStack as it stands right now has more than 600 APIs. Let's do a simple math. Let's say we take an average developer that can implement one view in a day. So that's 600 days, or about 2 years or slightly more than that of effort to actually build something from scratch, completely new. I actually discuss a lot with Paul and Giles, my colleagues and leaders at ShapeBlue, and we kind of felt that it's probably not the right time to work on something from scratch. So a lot of learning actually came from Project X. The other thing is this was manually drawn. So what I did was I looked into a lot of those APIs and resources, like entities and resources in CloudStack. For example, we know there are cloud resources, infrastructure resources, and then business resources. Cloud resources are things that users consumes, like your VM instance and volumes. Infrastructure things are like zones, pods, cluster hosts, and whatnot. And then you have those business resources like your user role, admins, and whatnot. And this graph tries to, I did this this exercise in Project X just to kind of see how can one entity relate to others. For example, a virtual machine can have volumes, can be owned by an account, and can run on a host which is part of a zone. So a lot of those things you also have to consider when you implement a UI, so you can navigate and go from one place to another place. That was kind of a hard problem to implement this on a large scale for all those 300 to 600 APIs. And I learned that it's probably best to bin this side project. The other thing, I think this is a slightly more my own successful side project, which started in 2012 when I was like, at that time, people used to first log into CloudStack, and then they would use the API to manually key in keys and parameters of an API in the browser to execute just an API. So if you are a UI developer, if you are an API developer, you add like a new API, you would do it manually, and thought, why isn't there a CLI for CloudStack? On the right hand side, you can see a GIF that shows you the latest CloudMonkey, which is a Golang based single binary. But that's not important. The important thing is, what are the lessons I learned? The lessons I learned is UI, even writing CLIs could be hard. Let's say if I were to support those 600 APIs, how would I do that? So at that time, I thought, let me first try to find out those 600 APIs. At that point of time, there was no API discovery feature. What I used then was to use Marvin library and then scan all the APIs in the Marvin library to find out those APIs and then come up with the convention. So the convention I came up with is most of the APIs in CloudStack were camel case. So let me split at the hump of the camel case. That means camel becomes the kind of verb, and the case in this example becomes sort of the subject or noun. So if you were to launch an API, you will simply, do it in this way. So you get APIs automatically executed and auto-completed in CloudMonkey. And then later on with another project, I was given to work on API docs. So it's funny story how API discovery came up. I was supposed to add some annotations on those 600 APIs on each of the parameters and each of the APIs to generate API docs for users. I thought, can I do something clever and interesting to make it online? That means you can do some sort of API discovery. That means have an online API docs. That's how API discovery came up. And I used API discovery in CloudMonkey to allow the sync feature. So you get, so that kind of enables, the lesson learned is that enables the release management development of CloudMonkey to be separate from CloudStack. So you can sync those APIs and add new features in CloudMonkey. And every time there's a new release of CloudStack, I don't need to release a new version of CloudMonkey because of the sync feature. Then some other features came in, like parameter completion. And the way I did that was I added some annotations in the APIs. I did it once and it took me like 2-3 months to get it done. But then after that, it became a standard, and more people, when they added the APIs, they I think unconsciously added those parameters. And what those parameters did was allowed me to do parameter completion. For example, there's an API which accepts an ID parameter that is of UUID type. So let me find how to get UUIDs for that parameter. So we do some sort of convention-based discovery. That means, let's say, if the keyword is storage ID, most likely storage ID is returned by an API which lists storage or some relevant API. So that's how parameter kind of completion came up. So now I've been struggling with the idea that let's do a modern UI that's kind of declarative. That means I just say that go and display this. I don't need to tell the UI in terms of code that how you show that exactly from a DOM point of view. Like, how do you actually display the data? I just say go and display this data. I don't care how you display this data. And I want the new UI to have API discovery and parameter completion like CloudMonkey. Why? Because there's 600 APIs. That's still 1 to 2 years worth of effort if one has to do it from scratch. So how can I reduce that time? Can I do something smart and intelligent to do it? Can I use both API discovery and parameter completion to do auto-generated UI widgets? Can I make use of the knowledge of what APIs are available, what parameters are available, what types of those parameters are, and how can I complete them to automatically generate these widgets and whatnot? And can I have a more role-based permission? So right now in CloudStack, we have a strict assumption that you have a root admin, a domain admin, and a user, and there are certain APIs that are allowed for each of those types. With the introduction of the dynamic roles feature, you can now create a custom role and say, this role can only do, let's say, read-only admin. That means it can only do all the APIs that start with list star or get star, and those things are now possible. So can the UI not assume the user to be of any of those three static types? Can we simply work on the fact that these are the APIs available and whether you are able to execute that API or not? So that was sort of, I think these are sort of my things that I discussed with Paul and say, let's discuss what are the requirements. So a lot of input also came from Paul on this. And one thing I wanted to do was, let's see if we can adopt some modern techniques, some development styles. Can we make it easy for people to understand, read, extend, develop, maintain? So those are the requirements. The last thing I would add is, if you look at CloudStack's API and codebase in general, when we started some 10, 11 years ago, the codebase, a lot of the projects were not available, so we had to build everything ourselves from scratch. So whether it is the database layer in CloudStack, whether it's the console proxy, whether it's the plugin system, whether in the UI specifically, we have our own UI framework on top of jQuery. Then we have our own styling UI framework that helps us to draw the tables, buttons, and icons and all of that. So I want to not use I want to limit creating something new. So let's go and be let's ensure the UI could be a very good open source project in the sense that it reuses other relevant and good open source projects so that we don't have to do it ourselves. Let me just give you an example of and talks something about API discovery and parameter completion. So this is what I've sort of already explained, that there's an API called list APIs. You execute that and you get like an array of various APIs that you are allowed for a logged in user or the user with the given API keys and secret keys. In the API request, so as part of the response of the list APIs, we get the API name and an array of arguments that you can use. So, and for each argument, you get a type and some description, some limits like length and things like that. And we also know for each API, what is the response may look like, what kind of JSON may be returned as part of the API response. And during the development, you'll see that there is a convention-driven mapping of APIs for all input types and arguments. So if there is a keyword called virtual machine ID, that will be used across other APIs that have something to do with virtual machines and things like that. There was one thing I mentioned in the requirements slide, which was we want to make it declarative. So this is a slide where I want to introduce you to web components. For me also, this was something new about 1 to 2 years ago. What a web component is, it's a reusable building block, and it promotes encapsulation and interoperability. On the right hand side, you can see it's a web component where you define the HTML. So you see there's a template with some greeting in double curly braces. So that's what the structure should look like. You have a script where you can put in some code to say what a variable or value or a method, you can declare all those things in that block. And then you have a style. So this is a example of a view component where you define a new HTML element called hello, you can see. So you put it there in your in any web page in an HTML file, and you get this sort of new component. So HTML5 kind of gives you those basic components like paragraph, like a button, like a radio button and checkbox and those kind of things. But the idea of web component is, can you define and create something new, sort of a black box that takes in some inputs, does some behavior, maybe it can give you an output also. And the idea is that if we have something like this, notice here we haven't actually told where this component, in what section, in what CSS selector it will go and render this element. So that's the idea of declarative programming. You simply want to declare a variable and let the code figure out the DOMs and whatnot. So with these requirements, I actually went and tried to survey existing CloudStack UI, because again, I sincerely don't want to start something from scratch, because as I mentioned, it's a lot of work. So I looked into some existing UIs, and primarily I think the most up-to-date UI, open source UI, is the UI from Bitworks. But the issue is that it doesn't still fulfill all those requirements that we discussed, specifically the ease of extension, API discovery. How can it adapt to changes in the API? How can it discover new APIs and show widgets? So all those things were not possible. The other thing I should mention is Project X, which was my side project experiment, was written using Bootstrap, using AngularJS, and the earlier AngularJS, and Bitworks UI is now written in Material UI and uses AngularJS. But the thing about AngularJS is, we as a community, the API has been broken a couple of times, and it's a very large framework to do that. So when I looked into the Bitworks CloudStack UI code base, it was hard for me to understand. I couldn't actually understand anything. Because the components were not clear enough, like the implementation was not clear enough for me to develop. So one of the requirements was also that it's easy to learn and develop and extend. And the main thing is it doesn't support AutoDiscovery and all those cool requirements. So Bitworks UI was probably not going to make it. Further down, it was primarily a UI, a user-facing UI, so just for the users. And what I wanted in the new modern UI was something that can do all APIs, a role-based API. So it doesn't assume whether it is a user or admin. It should just say, I have logged in, tell me what are the APIs. Based on the APIs, these are the things you can do in the UI. I looked into a couple of more, and there I actually found a couple of interesting UIs and portals from other friends in the community, but they were not open source. They were specific to their organization or their user base, so that's not going to cut it. Then I looked, then I kind of, early in this year, I kind of decided that doesn't look like I have to start from scratch, because I surveyed everything and I couldn't find anything suitable for that modern UI. So I surveyed various JavaScript frameworks, where the idea is that JavaScript framework is specifically just for the logic. I also looked into some front-end frameworks, because I don't want to write my own framework on how to draw an icon, draw a button, draw this, that. I want something ready-made that I can take off the shelf, and it has to be open source. So I looked into various options. And I also learned and looked into some modern toolings and methodologies and taught myself that. And one thing I really like is we at Apache, we are community driven. So the dependencies and all the things that we should use should also reflect that. It has to be community based. It has to be something like Apache. And one thing I really like is Vue.js. It's a very widely popular progressive web framework. It was started by one person, then it formed a community around that. So compared to AngularJS and React.js, it was much easier to learn. That's my personal opinion. and it was more community oriented. There was no company to dictate rules and whatnot. So I really liked that. The other thing is, there's tons of resources and a lot of other open source projects. Like GitLab is a big user, and there are other organizations. If you search, they are using Vue.js. The last thing I really like about Vue.js is you can take Vue.js in an existing UI. So even our current UI, you can use Vue.js to extend some views. So it is easy to kind of mix. And compared to, I think, React.js, AngularJS, it was easy for me to learn. So I spent like 1 weekend on each framework, so about in 8 hours. And the idea was, in 8 hours should be good enough to write something. If not, then that framework is not good enough for me. If it takes me, let's say, a week to learn, then it might take a lot more time to make something from that. So with that, I really like Vue.js. The other thing I liked about Vue.js is they have a concept of a single file component. So on the right hand side, you can see the same hello component example, where in a single file, you define the structure, which is the HTML. You define the code, that is the script or JavaScript. And you can also have CSS in that. So you can build components, reusable components, and then you can import, you can pass them as a variable. The cool stuff you can do in Vue.js, I really like that. The other thing I looked at was UI frameworks. So I don't want to build my own components, like your menu bars, your buttons, your badges, drop downs, all of that. I don't want to build on my own. So I looked into various things like Bootstrap, Semantic UI. Then I came upon this and design. What I really like about and design is typically if you look into how UI products are developed, there is a product designer, and it's really good to see that this project actually does this very well. They have a ton of document that doesn't talk about code or how to use and design, but from a spec point of view, a specification point of view, what should this UI look like? And very large users like Alibaba, Tencent, most of the users from China, they use this product in their production websites. They have so it's like, if I use and design, I don't have to worry about the graphical UI specification. I, as a developer, can just use it off the shelf, because somebody has already defined what an enterprise UI looks like. On their website also, they mention this, that it is an enterprise class UI design framework and project. Again, tons of stars you can see. They don't say it's a UI framework, they say it's a design language, you can see on the GitLab box. And so they have this design specification, and that specification they have implemented it for AngularJS, Vue.js, React.js. So that means you have a consistent specification implemented for different frameworks you can use. So I picked this one, and I want to introduce you to this side project of mine. I'm calling it Primate. It's a UI. It's a modern CloudStack UI side project of mine that I started earlier this year. That does AutoDiscovery. So all the stuff you see, it's API AutoDiscovery, auto widget generation, parameter completion. I wrote a couple of code that is similar to the code I had written for CloudMonkey, and I couldn't believe myself, because this was a feasibility exercise. I did that for one specific API, then I added some declarative way to say these are the APIs I want to show, and this thing works now for 600 APIs. So let's say it took me 3-4 weekends to get this POC done. In this 4 weekends, I could then support 600 or any API. That was something I wanted to do. Here you can see a snapshot of the UI, and I'll invite my colleague Anurag to talk and give a demo of this. But what I'll briefly mention is all the stuff you see right now. It does support all the APIs in CloudStack. It does everything role-based, so things kind of show or hide depending on what APIs you are allowed to see and execute or not. There is no assumption whether it is a user, a domain admin, or an admin. And this thing works on all devices, like your phones, tablets. It's easy to extend. The core code that does auto-completion and all that is about maybe less than 1,000 lines of code. So it's easier and small and compact that way. So without further ado, let me pass it to Anurag, who will show us some demo, and then I'll come back again to talk about this UI.
Thank you, Rohit. So let me quickly drag this around. So this is the login page. Some of the functionalities are still not implemented, so there will be a lot of rough edges. Please bear with that. So let's first try to do some sort of invalid login. So we see on the top like fail to authenticate. So that means authentication works. Let's go ahead and log in as the admin. So this is the main dashboard. So one thing to call out, like Rohit mentioned, the UI development and the core CloudStack development is now independent. That means we don't have to rebuild internally. I will show you in a few minutes that we can actually point the primate code to point to any specific running management server API URL, and it will point to that. So let's just quickly walk through this main dashboard page. So on the left hand side, we see all these menus. It can expand, collapse, right? So almost all the functionality is already there in the UI code. The center part is the dashboard. It's very easy to use. And one thing I should call out here is that underlying the and design, we have this card-based development, and all these things you see in terms of code is a single component. Right now, this is sort of including a graph, but there is a large amount of flexibility. So we can actually customize these cards, and we'll see some examples for the virtual machines detail view. It actually gives us a lot of flexibility without actually touching the code of the infrastructure side. On the right hand side, we see all these events. So it polls, and we can actually see here. So it's not fitting entirely here. We can go to the details view, and we see all these events. Right. On the top side, you can actually see all these breadcrumbs like the dashboard, the language. So this is the localization. What we have done is we have actually sort of analyzed the old UI code and extracted all the human readable strings, and we have sort of mapped them to the new translation files as well. We'll see a live demo in a few minutes. The notifications, the menu. Let's actually also look at the project views. So project views are also supported. So there you have it. So we have different cards for the project, and again the events are here. Let me go back to the default view and actually show you how we can actually show the mobile view. So like Rohit mentioned, actually Vue.js helps us directly port our current component-based code to a mobile-specific view. So there you have it. Like this is how the current primate will look on an iPhone X, for instance. Here's how it would look on the iPad. And all of this comes out of the box. Like we don't have to put extra effort for device-specific translations. Let's go back to the...
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Will these gauges update real time? Or
Yeah.
do you have to refresh the page?
It's still rough around the edges, but they do. If you scroll up, there's a refresh button you can see, and there is a drop down where if you have multiple zones, there's a searchable drop down, so you can search both across projects and zones and select that zone.
You have to keep clicking the refresh button.
Right. So let's take an example at the end of these slides, because there's a auto refresh feature you'll just see in some time.
So unlike the old UI where all the zone specific statistics are dumped on the same page, we actually have filtered them out for specific zones. This is my local CloudStack instance, so I just have one zone for demo purposes, but it could potentially have multiple zones, and we can actually try to search here. Okay. So the next thing to talk about is actually web browser history. And like personally, when I started working on the CloudStack UI, it was very painful. Every time I was developing, I would refresh, all the notifications on the top were gone, and I'll have to again scroll through the entire UI and then reach that stage. So on the browser address, actually you see, it's not just 8080/client. It points to a specific URL, right? And this is actually preserved. So for instance, if I go here, it goes to a guest network. So what that means is, whenever I hit this particular URL, I'm sure to get my specific role-specific view here. It doesn't have to be refreshed or scrolled through the entire UI path. Again, like some of the functionalities that are super nice come with the ant view. So we can expand and collapse the left-hand bar. All these things are components that ant provides. And I'll show you, like towards the end, I'll show you some snippets of the code, how we have implemented it declarative-wise. What else? Okay, so let me show you this. So like if I go to this volume detail view and I press back, the old UI, as you would know, go back to the dashboard. But here we can actually press back. So what it's showing is we are actually maintaining browser history and we are caching the entire path. Sounds trivial, but it was very painful with the old UI. Okay, let's quickly walk through the central resource component. So this entire table, right now it's showing the volume specific resource. We actually haven't hard-coded this. This is again a reusable component that Rohit was talking about. And we just have to specify the columns and the order in which they should appear in a single configuration file. And it automatically populates for us. Some things more that you'll notice is that we actually have these some items that are actually clickable. So what we can potentially do is, for instance, let's click this thing. So we directly come to that particular zone and notice the URL here. It actually specifies which zone ID we can actually go to. Again, like I can press back and I will come back to that same page instead of having to go back to that. Another small functionality that, it's not, is over here. We can actually click to copy, and like most of the times we have to copy UUID, so we can use that. Notice this detail view. This is the same card component that has been customized for the detail view of the zone. And this is not hard-coded. Like Rohit mentioned, we have API discovery. When we get back a response for a particular API, we populate these cards. Now this is very primitive. We haven't done any customization. That is still something that we'll go ahead and do in future. Okay, one more thing that you'll see is that we have this refresh button, but we also have an auto refresh. What this will do is it will periodically fetch the new updates for this particular resource, and that sometimes becomes helpful. So like if I don't think I have anything concrete to reflect here, but let's say if I'm on the volume, so we have this state. Some of the times, so you see this refresh thing that happens. What if you have an operation running in the background that's an async operation? This auto refresh will actually help the UI, who are actually CloudStack users, to see the state without actually having to deep dive in or refresh every time. So small feature, but pretty useful. Okay, let's actually take a look at translation. So this is currently English, but the translation is also much smoother now, and it happens on the fly. So you'll notice that some of the text is not translated, and it's because we don't have the mapping of that particular string in the translation files that we have. The default fallback language is English, so we see utilization here. But notice on the left-hand menu and on the header, all of this translates very smoothly and in real time without us having to refresh the whole or restart the management server, for instance. Okay, let's take a quick look at the compute instances, because we have done a lot of customization there. So let's go into the detailed view of this. Again, the underlying is still a card, but we have a lot of customizations here. This is a card, but it provides a lot of, it's very elegant to look at. We have hardware, we have statistics, settings, so all of them are not working, as I said, but we have these customization options. Okay, let's try to look at these actions. These actions are also filtered out as per the user role, and also that this particular state supports. For instance, we cannot stop a virtual machine that's already stopped, so we have them disabled. Again, context-driven rendering, but pretty useful. So let's try to start this virtual machine. I want to first show the API AutoDiscovery part. if we try to click here, it gives me the cluster ID, for instance, that currently this particular role user can deploy a virtual machine in. Right? I'm not going to select that. I'm just going to deploy this. Notice on the top corner, we have this async job puller. And there you have it. The virtual machine is running. The state gets updated. And all of that because of this auto refresh and this. Another thing to call out is these notifications don't go away. For instance, if I close this and I come back, it's still there. So this helps us keep track of the particular action events and anything that we are trying to track. Let's go back to that compute page. Notice on the top, we don't show actually all the actions, but as we select a virtual machine, for instance, some of the actions actually pop up, right? We can try to stop the VM. And you'll see this progressing. Okay. What else?
Some of the features don't actually work, like the groupable feature Anurag was showing.
Yeah,
it doesn't actually work.
Okay, let's quickly take a look at the user view, how it would look to a user. So I'm going to log out and I'm going to log in as a user. Notice on the top, on the left, the resources that the user should not see, he cannot actually see. The virtual machines are filtered. Something else. So, like, because we have these URLs, one might think like, what if the user has an knowledge of the particular URL? Can he open that? So we have these checks in place. So like, it's not found or he's not allowed. Okay, I think like that covers most of the UI specific stuff. I can jump into the code. Do you want to add something to the?
Maybe if you can again log in as a root admin, there are a couple of things I'll just briefly mention. One thing is, as soon as you log in, we kind of do auto API discovery, and that means all those things you see on the left hand side, all the navigation is dynamically rendered based on what the API discovery tells Primate. That means if it tells that you cannot do list zones, you cannot do list infrastructure. One thing Anurag maybe we wanted to mention was when we log in as a user, the infrastructure tab itself was gone. And the code for that doesn't assume anything based on the type of the user. It is tied up with the API discovery. So based on the API discovery, it will automatically show or hide some buttons, tab details. And what Anurag showed was, if you know the path to list all the hosts or zones, if you try to trigger that API URL, you'll get a 404 because your role is not allowed to execute that API. One more thing I would like to add here is, when he clicked on that plus button to deploy a VM, all those things you see here, it's something what, let's say, how CloudMonkey would render when you do a tab on an API. Just that we are doing this in the UI form. That means, let's look into one of the things like disk offering IDs. So that is the API parameter that you can pass to this API. In the gray area, in the box itself, there is some API doc itself, like the ID of the disk offering for the virtual machine, so on and so forth. So this API doc is also from that dynamically discovered API and their parameters. When we click on any of those things, like Anurag was clicking on the disk offering ID, all those things you see, the rendering is also dynamic. We don't know which API to call. We simply try to auto-discover. And just like CloudMonkey, when you do a tab and it will list you the UIDs and the names, it's simply doing that in a list form. And if you scroll to the bottom, Anurag, it will discover what are the required parameters for an API. So the form automatically enforces that. So some of the parameters have that red asterisk. That means those are the required parameters. Now all of this, as you can see, there's no filtering on what things to show or hide. But our next step is that Anurag will show you how we have a declarative config file where you can simply say, for this API, use this icon and show only these fields. So, for example, the plus button, we say this is a plus button. The API is called deploy virtual machine. And here we haven't actually defined or we have enforced in code that only show these parameters. for the demo, we want to show all the parameters which a user can pass. But the emphasis here is the UI is completely API driven. It uses API discovery and not parameter completion. Now, there are some caveats with this kind of approach, which is when everything becomes API driven or data driven, it may not give you that user experience. So one of the things that Anurag showed you was, can you go back outside of this?
Yes.
I'll close this form. So one of the things he was showing you is a custom component. Now here also, what we do is in this config file, we say instead of the generic widget that shows you all those things, like he showed you the zone example where we are basically listing out the JSON response in various cards. Here is an example of a type of component which can display data about a virtual machine with little assumption about what the things could be in that JSON. So it's just an example on how easy it is to customize. I think those are a couple of things I'll add.
Yeah.
If you go to the instances page, Anurag, there's the tabular view. There's also a cards view. So next to search.
Yes.
So if you click on this, you can see different ways. And again, to implement this view, it took me like maybe 10 minutes because all it is a for loop that instead of printing rows in a table, it is like printing them as individual cards. It is possible because you're reusing components and you're simply saying, this is my data, render this in a component, in a card component, and show this like this. So it's just a for loop. Maybe Anurag can show an example of deploying a VM.
One more thing I wanted to call out. So you see this form, it's not actually, so what it's doing is with the API discovery, it knows what kind of parameter it is. And it will, for example, for a Boolean flag, it will automatically populate this particular sort of widget. If it's a value, for instance, there should be a place where, so like we can actually increase and decrease. And none of this is hard-coded. Based on the API discovery, we know the type of the parameter and we show the corresponding type of UI widget. Okay. So let's try to start a VM, for instance. So it will tell us like what particular fields are required and we have to provide them. So let's provide a template ID.
Say show VM to true. There's a display VM argument you have to set it to true.
Yes. So we have this, and now we get this.
So we haven't actually started the VM because it will take a lot of time to do this.
Yeah. Okay. So that was just a very quick walkthrough of what the current UI looks like, what functionalities are actually working. Let me quickly show you a few things in terms of code. Right. So this is the primary config file, for instance, where we are specifying the URL to the management server. So you look at this URL. If you want to point this to a different management server instance, all we have to do is change this URL. There's another file we should look at. So this is a sample component. If you remember what Rohit was talking about in terms of web component, this is a declarative style of implementing that component. We have one component that consumes this compute.js and just try to read this. This is just a simple like JavaScript object, name, title, icon. We specify the hidden columns, for instance, and we specify this actions, and all these actions just take this specific set of parameters. So this is what he meant by declarative style of programming. And on the left hand side, we have, hold on. Yeah, so here we have all these different sections, and all of them will actually look like just like the compute thing. We specify a set of parameters. The primate code will pick this config file and it will render that particular component. So it's very easy to extend it with the API discovery and this declarative style of programming. Adding more APIs, adding new features makes it very easy for developers to implement the UI. One more interesting thing was, let me show you. So Vue supports hot reloading. what hot reloading is that when we try to change the code, so let me go to compute.js. This thing is currently actually let me
maybe first show them the current UI so that they know we are not cheating.
So here, if you look at this compute section, we have instances, SSH keybase, and affinity groups. Now let me go back to the code.
So the demo Anurag is trying to show is, let's say I want to add like a new plugin or some new feature with an API, how easy it is to start. And what we do is in this config file, we simply add a small block that describes what the name should look like, what should the title be, what should be the icon, and what should be the component to render that view.
Yep.
And he'll save this file.
So as soon as I save this file,
the UI will kind of auto refresh if it is a config file, and he'll show if we make changes to the component, he will show hot reloading. That means UI development is faster. You make changes and you see them in the browser.
It makes very easy for developers to see how changes are being reflected almost in real time. So for instance, if you look at this particular part, the component that we are using is test view. So let's go to the test view file. And this is the very simple example. Like we can add anything here. And if we save it and we go back, it just gets updated. So it's very easy for developers. They don't have to rebuild. That's a pretty exciting thing for me for Vue, from the perspective of using Vue.js.
So in contrast, just let me add, in the current CloudStack development, most people when they start, they tend to rebuild the entire code base. While for the current code base, you don't actually need to do that. So they will spend anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes just to build CloudStack, then starting CloudStack again will take 5 minutes on their laptops, then they'll hit refresh. In last couple of years, we found some tricks, like you don't need to rebuild CloudStack. For example, you can simply go to the target client directory and make changes, refresh. Once you're satisfied, you'll copy the code back to this thing, to the Git repository. Again, that is possible, but as a developer, it's painful. It's not what I want. Now, what Anurag has just shown is how we separate development, testing, review, iteration cycle, all of that of the UI separate from the management server. You can point the code base to any management server you want, as long as it supports that path. And he has shown that there are config files, the JS config file. Maybe Anurag, you can show the default settings.js file,
yes,
which may be available at a path like etc CloudStack primate or something like that. So an admin can simply, let's say if an admin doesn't want a column to be shown to the users, simply remove that key or add that key. That's what declarative is. You are not programming. You're simply saying, I want this API to be shown with this API. You want some parameters to be shown, some columns or fields in the forms to be hidden or shown. You can do that in a declarative way. Now this is the main settings file, and here you can see you can actually give some options around the themes. You can specify the paths to the API base. You can give some customization in the UI, like your icon. Those things can happen actually here. We don't have a demo to show the icon, but for example, you can change the app type title. There's a button to find help. You can change that, and you can. We want this the UI to be kind of a white label UI. You can extend, modify, change, and do whatever you want with that.
Yeah. One more thing is that the pagination is now not a fixed thing. We can actually change it, and even when we try to reopen the window, the pagination still sticks to it.
So a lot of the configuration is we are using local storage, the browser local storage. So Anurag showed us an example where he would close the browser and open the UI again, and notifications were not gone, including other options like your project settings, your translation. Those things are saved in your in local storage as a JSON key. So UI kind of allows you to do a lot of that.
So I think we have about 10 minutes left. So Rohit, you want to take up for the next?
Sure, thank you, Anurag. Yes. Let's give a round of applause to Anurag for the demo. Right, so guys, that's Primate for you. Just to summarize what we have, couple of things I want to add on the side project Primate is it's completely it's small and concise, written using Vue.js and design, declarative programming, config-driven programming, you can say. We saw example of hot reloading. Let me also mention that we do vendoring. In the current CloudStack code, a lot of the dependencies like JavaScript library and CSS stuff, all of that is part of the code base. We don't want that. We don't want developer to manually manage dependencies and their version security issues and things like that. So code base actually supports that as well. Again, this is a single page app, so you can actually compile and copy the code base to an existing cloud stack, and instead of index.html, change to something else like primary.html, and you can actually host both the old UI and the new primary on the same server. You can do that. One thing I want to emphasize is we want to do clean and separate development lifecycle. So you can build the UI, release much faster, because UI is one of those types of project that can iterate much faster. So we want that flexibility, and it's easy to learn. Like a Java developer with no background in UI or JavaScript, I could pick Vue.js, start programming in about 3 to 4 hours. I could get through very basic concepts like your loops, conditionals, variable types, and passing properties and components. I could do that, and again, I want to emphasize that it's a multi-set UI. That means doesn't assume that it is for a type of audience or a user. It's completely role based. That means it supports for admin, user, any custom role. So that is out of box. So I think we have already stressed upon API discovery, widget auto generation, but let me also emphasize that that's something you get out of the box. But again, if you want some specific custom UX behavior, you can implement a custom component, just like we saw for the compute instance, and we also saw that demo thing we added dynamically. We have URL router and browser history, so you can go back and forth. You must have noticed that in the table there were other options like zones. So when you click on that, it will take the view from that specific page to a zone, and you can again click on the back button to go back. Again, we are trying to use as much as modern browser supported features like local storage and things like that. We also saw dynamic translations. So now in the current UI, you have to actually log out and log in again when you want to change translation. So we want to fix that as well. Translation is dynamic, and again, we don't want everything from scratch. So Anurag has actually put a lot of effort to make sure how can we best reuse the existing translation as much as possible. So we saw example on that as well. And lastly, we want to support all form factors, all types of screens, desktop, tablets, mobile screens. Let me also mention the UI supports 4K. That means all the icons and images, they are SVG based. They will adapt and they'll look nicer on your 2K and 4K screens. And I think we have seen that. I simply want to thank and give credits to a lot of people. When I started this project, I actually showed the first demo to both Paul and Giles just to show them, okay, this is what I've done. Do you see any value in this? Do you think it can actually become something bigger? So many thanks to Paul and Giles and entire ShadeBlue team for their support and requirement and feedback and whatnot. Then actually what happened was, as I was doing this was about first half of 2019, Jan-Feb, that timeline, I actually saw in the master code base, we upgraded the jQuery version to the latest because of some security and other issues, and I saw that triggered a lot of issues in the current UI, because the current UI is imperative DOM style programming. It assumes width and what to show this and that, and a lot of the code base in the UI got broken. And I noticed that a lot of people, especially from eWork, like Sven, Max Weber, Philip, and a lot of their colleagues, they were contributing pull requests. So I thought maybe they know something about UI. Let me go and talk to them. So I was kind of unsure. So we want to do this Apache way, but at that time this was still a POC. I wanted to make sure to get early feedback, and if they want to guide me or around best practices and stuff like that. So a lot of thanks to Sven for that. Max actually helped with a lot of CSS refactoring. He introduced SCSS and a lot of stuff that I actually don't understand, but the stuff in the dashboard, you saw how it adapted very well on the mobile phone. That was done by Max. Philip also did a lot of stuff about the config changes, refactoring them. Again, without open source projects like Vue.js and design, it would be hard. The last thing I would mention is I actually, when I started, I didn't want to start exactly from scratch. So I also looked into, is there a boilerplate code just for an admin theme so that I have something to start with. So I started with this open source template. For the fonts, again, we are using an open source project called FortAwesome. And there were few cat icons you saw in the 404 exceptions. So they were done by a designer, and I got a request and they allowed me to use this icon. So if we were to use this in our open source project, we can, because the author has allowed us to do this. What is next? So this is the link. I'll probably make it public in quite some time now. From the starting, we are ensuring that this is a Apache compliant, Apache 2.0 licensed code base. And what I want to do is, I'm using the conference as a way to kind of introduce this to you all. I want to build support around this. Next steps would be to, not just you all here, but also include other people and find their feedback, gather support, seek reviews and requirements, any feedback. And we have a hackathon session in the conference. So maybe if anyone of us are interested, we can have a small group just to discuss Primate and other UI aspects around the project. In the next few months, what I want to do is, I want to make sure that whoever is interested, we work together to make sure the UI, it's still a POC, so I would emphasize that. I don't know whether it is prime time for CloudStack as a project to accept this. So we want to make sure that we reach feature and functionality parity with the current CloudStack UI. And once that is done, I think the proposed timeline would be we do a lot of that, do the Apache way, build support, propose, seek vote on the dev mailing list. When we reach a stage where the code base is good enough, we want to start a discussion about accepting this in the project. And the rough timeline would be that around, let's say, the first quarter of 2020, that is around and after 4.14, we reach a technical preview or a beta stage. That means UI becomes more or less functional like the old one. We might still have some bugs, some missing features and whatnot. So we work on that, but we want to be able to reach that stage so we can give it out as a beta technical preview for the users to play with. And then after that, in the next 6 months or so, we work on the documentation, notes, gather feedback, do all that iteration, and come up with a proper upgrade path and migration path. So proposal could be that, let's say after 4.14, we stop working on the old UI. If everything, the community accepts and the UI kind of looks feasible, and the general availability from a release point of view can be done on and after 4.15. That means second half of 2020. That's sort of the proposed timeline for the code base in the project. Okay, thank you everyone. Do we have any questions? Yes, please.
I think first I must commend you on choice of view. We have struggled with Angular.
Right.
We started building our own UI in 2015. 1.5 years we struggled with Angular, then we moved to Vue and even good back. Vue, I think, gives you a lot of flexibility and it's far easier to build on than anything else. And I think one of the things we should look at also is now two-factor authentication, especially from a security perspective, which becomes very, very important. And you get a lot of client demand to have that SMS-based or some token-based two-factor. And we would love to actually commit to this. We've got 11 engineers who are experts on Vue. At least people definitely get a couple of them senior guys to start with. It's a great thing to do.
Great. Yes, Anthony.
I said what you're saying. Can you point the UI at multiple management servers simultaneously?
No. Right now, it has to be one per management server.
I see. For those of us that run a cluster or distributed.
So actually, I when I started the sort of feasibility POC, I actually tried to do that because in CloudMonkey, you can basically point to different management servers, change the profile. The issue with that is browsers, they will enforce CSRF. Basically, you are not allowed to, you're hosting your website somewhere else and you want to talk to somewhere else and do authentication, all that. So browser kind of, due to the browser limitation, that is limiting. But I would add that it is actually possible in a different way. We are not showing the demo here. Maybe I can show you some examples privately. We have an open source project called etc.n where you can wrap a web application like this, it's a single page application, that means it's a client. So with Electron, you can actually have a drop down, you can have server profiles, store them in a config, select whatever management server you want with some UI customization icons and whatnot, and you can have like a desktop client where the CSRF limitations, those are not enforced. And you can then talk to different management servers, have a desktop primate basically. Right. Okay. Thank you guys.